Sometimes love finds you when you've given up looking for it. Sometimes it arrives half-frozen on your doorstep during the worst blizzard in 20 years. Bo Callahan had been alone in the Montana mountains for 15 winters, and he liked it that way. No one to disappoint, no one to lose. Then he found Rosalind Hart collapsed in the snow outside his cabin. She was running from something back east, something that put fear in her eyes and desperation in her voice. As he carried her inside, Bo didn't know that saving this woman would change everything he thought he knew about himself. The townsfolk below called him dangerous, a wild man who couldn't be tamed. What would drive a refined lady to seek shelter with a man like him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm that brought Rosalind Hart to Bo Callahan's door had been brewing for 3 days, and he'd felt it in his bones long before the first flakes fell. That was the way of things when you'd lived alone in the Montana Territory for 15 years. You learned to read the signs that civilized folks missed. The ache in his left shoulder, where a grizzly had taken a swipe at him 6 winters back, the way his old hound dog Rex started pacing and whining, the peculiar stillness that settled over the pines before nature unleashed her fury. Bo had made his preparations with the methodical care of a man who'd survived more storms than he cared to count. Split wood stacked to the cabin's eaves, enough dried meat and beans to last a month, oil for the lamps, and ammunition cleaned and counted. He'd learned long ago that the mountains showed no mercy to the unprepared, and while he'd made his peace with dying alone up here someday, he wasn't fool enough to hasten that day through carelessness. The cabin itself stood testament to his years of solitary craftsmanship: thick, hewn logs chinked tight against the wind, a stone fireplace that drew clean and threw heat into every corner, windows positioned to catch the morning sun and watch the valley approaches. It wasn't much by the standards of the world he'd left behind, but it was his, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled himself. In the long evenings, when the work was done and the fire settled to glowing coals, he sometimes took out his worn leather journal and wrote about his days. Not poetry or sentiment, mind you, but practical observations about weather patterns, animal migrations, which herbs grew where and when. Most folks who knew him in passing, the traders who bought his pelts each spring, the occasional lost traveler he guided back to the main trail, figured him for an illiterate mountain man, all instinct and no learning. They saw the beard that covered half his face, the clothes that spoke of function over fashion, the way he used silence like other men used words. They didn't know that before he'd fled to these heights, he'd been Jacob Beauregard Callahan, college-educated son of a Virginia gentleman, a man who'd once worn fine suits and courted proper ladies in drawing rooms that smelled of rosewater and old money. But that life felt like someone else's story now, faded as the daguerreotype of his family that he kept wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his old army trunk. Up here, he was simply Bo, a man measured by his ability to read the weather, track game, and survive another winter. He traded with the Blackfoot when they passed through in summer, speaking their language better than most white men bothered to learn. He knew every game trail within a day's ride, every creek that ran clear year-round, every cave that offered shelter when the storms turned deadly. The morning he found her, he'd been checking his traplines before the worst of the weather hit. Rex had been acting strange all week, refusing to range far from the cabin, whining at shadows that Bo couldn't see. Dogs sensed things that men missed, and Rex had been his companion for 8 years now, ever since he'd found the pup half-starved beside its dead mother. If Rex was nervous, Bo paid attention. The snow had started sometime after midnight, fat flakes that promised a long, hard storm. By dawn, it was coming down so thick he could barely see from the cabin to the woodshed. He'd pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a wool scarf around his face, and ventured out to check the closest traps before visibility dropped to nothing. Rex stayed close, occasionally whimpering at the wind. That's when he saw the dark shape against his door. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal seeking shelter, maybe a deer driven down from the high country by the storm. But as he got closer, fighting through snow that was already knee-deep, his heart nearly stopped. It was a woman, dressed in traveling clothes that had no business in these mountains, collapsed against his cabin door, like she'd used the last of her strength just to reach it. She was unconscious when he knelt beside her, her lips blue with cold, her breathing so shallow he had to put his ear close to her mouth to be sure she was still alive. Ice crystals clung to her dark hair, and her hands, good Lord, her hands were like ice beneath thin leather gloves that offered about as much protection as tissue paper. How long had she been out there? How had she even found his cabin in this storm? He didn't waste time with questions. Scooping her up in his arms, he was struck by how light she felt, how fragile. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could see that despite the cold and exhaustion, she was a beautiful woman. Not mountain beautiful, with the weathered strength that came from hard living, but refined beautiful, the kind that belonged in parlors and ballrooms. What in God's name was she doing up here? Inside the cabin, he laid her on his bed and got to work with the efficiency of a man who'd seen his share of frostbite cases. Her boots came off first, expensive leather things that were soaked through and already freezing solid. Her feet were pale but not blackened. She'd be keeping all her toes if he had his way about it. Her traveling dress was wet through, and propriety be damned, he had to get her out of those clothes before hypothermia claimed her. He averted his eyes as much as practical decency allowed, wrapping her in his warmest blankets and building up the fire until the cabin felt like a furnace. Then he heated water and began the slow process of warming her hands and feet, careful not to go too fast and cause more damage. She moaned softly as sensation returned, a sound that tugged at something in his chest he'd thought he'd buried long ago. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness while the storm raged outside. He fed her sips of warm broth when she was lucid enough to swallow, checked her hands and feet for signs of permanent damage, and changed the blankets when fever made her sweat. In her delirium, she mumbled words he couldn't quite catch, sometimes calling out names that made her voice sharp with fear. Marcus was one. Father was another. And once, in a voice so broken it made his chest tight, she whispered, "Please don't," over and over, until he found himself stroking her hair and murmuring reassurances like she was a frightened child. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, she opened her eyes and looked directly at him with the clearest green gaze he'd ever seen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She took in the rough cabin walls, the bearskin rug beneath the bed, the smell of pine and wood smoke that permeated everything, and then her eyes came back to his face. "You saved my life," she said, her voice hoarse but unmistakably cultured, with the soft vowels of Eastern refinement. "Storm would have killed you if I hadn't," he replied, suddenly conscious of his own rough appearance, the way his voice sounded harsh after days of mostly silence. She tried to sit up and winced, one hand going to her head. "How long have I been here?" 4 days. Storm's moving on, but there's still plenty of snow out there." Her eyes widened with something that might have been panic. 4 days? I have to. She struggled to rise, and he gently but firmly pressed her back down. "You need to rest. Whatever you're running from, it can't follow you in weather like this." The look she gave him then was so full of gratitude and relief that it nearly undid him. When was the last time another human being had looked at him like that? When was the last time he'd felt like more than just a hermit hiding from the world? "I'm Rosalind," she said softly. "Rosalind Hart. Bo Callahan. And Miss Hart." She looked at him expectantly. "You're safe here. Whatever brought you up this mountain in the middle of winter, whatever you're afraid of, it can't reach you here." Something in her expression crumbled then, and he saw tears she was trying not to shed. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. Don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." He stood and moved to the stove, uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice, with the way her gratitude made him feel necessary for the first time in years. "Rest," he said gruffly. "We'll talk when you're stronger." But as he busied himself with preparing food, he could feel her watching him, and he found himself moving more carefully, aware of how his hands looked as he sliced bread, how his voice sounded when he spoke. She was changing things already. just by being here, just by making him see himself through someone else's eyes. Outside, the wind was finally dying down, but inside the cabin, something else was just beginning to stir. By the end of her first week at the cabin, Rosalind had regained enough strength to insist on helping with daily tasks, though Bo could see the effort cost her more than she let on. She moved with the careful precision of someone still recovering, but there was a determined set to her shoulders that spoke of inner steel beneath the refined exterior. She'd fashioned a makeshift apron from one of his old shirts and taken over the cooking, claiming it was the least she could do to repay his hospitality. "You don't owe me anything," he'd told her that first morning she'd attempted to make breakfast, watching her struggle with the unfamiliar weight of the cast-iron skillet. "Perhaps not," she'd replied, concentrating on not burning the cornbread, "but I've never been comfortable accepting charity without offering something in return." Charity. The word stung more than it should have. Was that how she saw his care? As obligation rather than what? What had he expected? He pushed the thought away and went to check his traps, leaving her to navigate the mysteries of his kitchen. The morning she announced her intention to leave, a cold snap had settled over the mountains, the kind that made the air sharp enough to cut. Bo was splitting wood behind the cabin when she approached, wrapped in his spare coat that hung nearly to her ankles. "The weather's clearing," she said without preamble. "I should be moving on." His axe stuck in the log with a solid thunk. "Moving on where?" "West. California, perhaps. Somewhere I can start fresh." He studied her face, noting the determined lift of her chin that didn't quite hide the uncertainty in her eyes. "You planning to walk there?" "I'll find a way. I always do." "Through 2 feet of snow, in those fancy boots that nearly cost you your toes?" He pulled the axe free and split another log with more force than necessary. "That's fool talk." Her spine stiffened. "I'm not a fool, Mr. Callahan. I may not be suited for this life, but I'm not helpless." "Didn't say you were helpless. Said leaving now would be foolish." He set down the axe and faced her fully. "Whatever you're running from followed you this far into the mountains. It's not going to give up easy. But it can't track you through snow this deep, and it sure as hell can't survive up here without knowing the country like I do." Something flickered across her face. Fear, or perhaps hope. "You think I'm in that much danger?" "I think a woman doesn't climb this high into nowhere unless something's chasing her that's worse than dying alone on a mountainside." The words hung between them in the crystalline air. Rosalind pulled his coat tighter around herself, and for a moment she looked so lost that his chest ached with the urge to comfort her. Instead, he picked up his axe and went back to splitting wood. "The storm took out the main trail," he said, not looking at her. "Won't be passable for weeks, maybe not till spring melt. You're stuck here whether you like it or not." When he glanced up, he expected to see frustration or despair. Instead, her expression held something that looked almost like relief. That afternoon, he went to gather her things from where he'd stowed them to dry, intending to move them to the small storage room where she could have more privacy. Her traveling bag had been soaked through when he'd brought her in, and he'd emptied it to prevent her belongings from mildewing. Most of it had been practical travel items, few changes of undergarments, a silver brush and mirror set that spoke of wealth, a small leather purse, with more money than most mountain folk saw in a year. But at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in what had once been fine tissue paper, he found something that stopped him cold. It was a wedding dress, or what remained of one. The silk had once been white, he could tell, but now it was stained and torn, the delicate fabric shredded as if someone had taken a knife to it in rage. The bodice was ripped down the front, buttons scattered or missing entirely. One sleeve hung by threads, and dark stains that might have been blood marked the skirt. He stared at the ruined dress for a long moment, his mind putting together pieces he'd been too careful to look for, the fear in her fevered mumbling, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the panic that had filled her eyes when she'd first awakened and realized how much time had passed. Oh God. He turned to find Rosalind in the doorway, her face white as the snow outside. She was staring at the dress in his hands with an expression of such anguish that he felt like he'd been kicked by a mule. "Rosalind, you weren't supposed to see that." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I should have thrown it away. I should have burned it, but two couldn't." The dress fell from his numb fingers. In 3 strides he was across the room, and without thinking he pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, collapsing against his chest like a dam had burst. Great, racking sobs shook her small frame, and he found himself stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort the way he might gentle a wounded animal. "Tell me," he said when the worst of the storm had passed. "Tell me what happened." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "His name is Marcus Thornfield. We were to be married, an arrangement between our families. I thought it was what I wanted. He was handsome, wealthy, everything a woman was supposed to desire in a husband." Her voice took on a hollow quality that made his jaw clench. But as the wedding approached, he began to show his true nature. Small cruelties at first. Comments about how I would need to learn my place, how wives should be seen and not heard. When I suggested postponing the ceremony, she touched her throat reflexively. He made it clear that the choice was no longer mine to make. The dress? Our wedding night was to be a week ago. When I tried to leave, when I told him I couldn't go through with it, her voice broke. He said if I was going to act like a whore, he'd treat me like one. He tore my dress, struck me. If his mother hadn't come looking for us, I think he might have. Rage, pure and clean as mountain water, flooded through Beau's veins. His hands clenched into fists before he could stop them, and he had to take a careful breath to keep his voice level. "How did you get away?" "I waited until he was drunk, celebrating with his friends. Took what money I could carry and ran. I've been traveling for 2 weeks, staying off the main roads, paying for passage with whatever I had. When I heard there were mountains to the west where a person could disappear, She laughed bitterly. "I suppose I thought I could simply vanish into the wilderness like some romantic heroine from a novel. And instead, you nearly froze to death on my doorstep. Instead, I found you." She looked up at him then with an expression so trusting, so grateful, that something fundamental shifted in his chest. "You saved me from more than just the cold, Beau. You gave me my life back." He cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the traces of tears. "Rosalind, I need you to understand something. A man like that, with the kind of money and connections you're describing, he's not going to let you just disappear. He'll send people looking." "I know." Her hand covered his where it rested against her cheek. "That's why I have to keep moving. I can't stay here and put you in danger." "The hell you can't." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, but he didn't care. "You think I'd let you walk back out into that storm? You think I'd stand by and let some Eastern dandy's hired guns drag you back to a man who'd hurt you? You don't understand what you'd be facing." "I understand plenty. I understand that Marcus Thornfield is about to learn what happens when someone threatens what's mine." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Rosalind's eyes widened, searching his face for something he wasn't sure he was brave enough to show her. "Yours?" she whispered. Instead of answering with words, he bent his head and kissed her. It was meant to be gentle, a simple affirmation of his protection, but the moment their lips met, something ignited between them. She melted against him with a soft sound that was part surprise, part relief, and he deepened the kiss, pouring 15 years of loneliness into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Rosalind's hands had fisted in his shirt, and the look in her eyes made his pulse race. "Stay," he said simply. "Stay until spring, until it's safe to travel. Stay and let me protect you." "And after spring?" That was the question that would haunt them both. After spring, when the passes cleared and the world became accessible again, what then? Could a refined Eastern lady really build a life with a mountain hermit? Could he ask her to give up everything she'd known for a man who'd forgotten how to live among civilized people? But looking down at her now, feeling the rightness of her in his arms, those questions seemed less important than the simple truth that she was here, she was safe, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't alone. "We'll figure it out," he said, and sealed the promise with another kiss. The kiss changed everything and nothing. Over the following days, they moved around each other with a new awareness, careful not to brush hands when passing the salt, hyper-conscious of the small space they shared. But necessity bred familiarity, and gradually the awkwardness gave way to something warmer, more natural. Rosalind threw herself into learning the skills that would help her survive in this harsh country. She insisted on taking over all the cooking, and while her first attempts at mountain cuisine were ambitious failures, she learned quickly. She studied the way Bo moved through his daily routine, noting how he banked the fire to last through the night, how he read the sky for weather signs, how he prepared and preserved food to last through the long winter months. "Show me," became her constant refrain. "Show me how to split kindling without taking off a finger. Show me which herbs will settle a stomach and which will poison a person. Show me how to read the tracks in the snow, so I'll know what's moving around the cabin at night." Bo found himself rediscovering his world through her eyes. Things he'd taken for granted, the way morning light caught the ice crystals on the window pane, the complex symphony of sounds that made up mountain silence. The satisfaction of a job done well with your own hands became new again when filtered through her wonder and curiosity. She was quick to learn and unafraid of hard work, though her hands blistered easily and her back ached after a day of tasks that was simple routine for him. He caught himself watching her more than was strictly necessary, admiring the determined set of her jaw when she tackled something difficult, the way she pushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead when she was concentrating. "You're staring," she said one afternoon as she struggled to master the art of feeding wood to the fire without letting it die or smoke them out of the cabin. "Sorry." But he didn't look away. "It's just you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered this, studying the play of firelight across her face. Someone who'd break easy, I suppose. Someone who'd spend all day weeping for her old life. She fed another piece of wood to the flames, and this time it caught properly. "Would you think less of me if I admitted I do weep for it? Late at night, when you're asleep and I think about everything I've lost." The honesty of it hit him square in the chest. "No," he said quietly. "I'd think you were human." They worked in comfortable silence after that, until she said, "What about you? Do you ever weep for your old life?" It was a fair question, considering what he'd asked of her. "I did, at first. Took me near 2 years to stop looking down the mountain every day, expecting to see someone riding up to fetch me home. But they never came. Nope, and eventually I realized that was exactly what I'd wanted all along." She nodded as if she understood, though he suspected her exile was a different creature entirely from his self-imposed hermitage. That evening, as she prepared their simple supper, he found himself studying her hands as she worked. They were healing from the frostbite, the skin pink and new, but he could see they'd been soft once, unused to rough work. Now they moved with growing confidence as she sliced the salt pork and stirred the beans. "Rosalind?" "I made something for you." She looked up, curious, as he retrieved a small bundle from his workbench. He'd been carving it in the evenings while she slept, working by firelight to shape the piece of maple he'd been saving for something special. Now, as he unwrapped it and held it out to her, he felt suddenly foolish. It was a comb, carved from pale wood and polished until it glowed like satin. The handle was decorated with a simple pattern of leaves and vines, and the teeth were evenly spaced and smooth as silk. It had taken him 3 evenings to get it right, and even then he'd worried it was too rough, too simple for a woman who'd once owned silver brushes and crystal perfume bottles. Rosalind took it with hands that trembled slightly, turning it over to examine every detail. "Oh, Bo, it's beautiful. It's just a comb, nothing fancy." "It's not just a comb." She looked up at him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "It's the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Before he could protest that it was nothing, she was in his arms, holding him with a fierceness that spoke of gratitude deeper than words. Her face was pressed against his chest, and he could feel the dampness of her tears through his shirt. "Hey," he said softly, stroking her hair. "What's all this about?" "Marcus gave me jewelry," she said, her voice muffled. expensive things chosen to show off his wealth, not because they meant anything to him or to me. But this, she pulled back to look at the comb again. You made this with your own hands, thinking of me. You saw that I needed something to manage my hair, and you spent time and care to craft something beautiful just for me. She was right, though he hadn't thought of it in quite those terms. He had noticed how she struggled with her long hair, trying to braid it with her fingers or tie it back with strips of fabric. The comb had been a practical solution, but as he'd shaped it, he'd found himself adding flourishes, wanting it to be worthy of her. "Try it," he said, suddenly eager to see if it worked the way he'd intended. She moved to the small mirror mounted near the wash basin and began working the comb through her hair. It glided smoothly, untangling the dark waves without pulling or catching. Within minutes, she'd managed to arrange her hair in a simple but elegant style that made her look more like the refined lady she'd been, yet somehow suited to this rustic place they shared. "It's perfect," she said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Thank you." That night, as they sat by the fire sharing the evening meal she'd prepared, Bo felt something settle into place in his chest. This was what he'd been missing all these years, not just companionship, but partnership. Someone to share the daily rhythms of life. Someone who noticed and appreciated the small gestures that made existence more than mere survival. "Bo?" Rosalind's voice was thoughtful as she set down her cup of coffee. "Yes? When I was a child, I used to imagine what it would be like to live simply, to wake up each morning with only the day's necessary tasks ahead of me, no social obligations or expectations beyond taking care of my home and the person I loved." She looked around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture, the utilitarian beauty of a life pared down to essentials. "I thought it was just a child's fantasy. And now I think maybe it was a glimpse of what I was really meant for." She met his eyes across the small table. "I've never felt more myself than I do here, learning to build a fire and bake bread and be useful in ways that matter." The confession hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities neither was quite ready to voice. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the harsh realities that surrounded their small oasis of warmth and growing affection. But inside, in the golden circle of firelight, something precious was taking root, something that might, given time and care, grow strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. 2 weeks passed in this growing harmony before curiosity finally overcame Rosalind's natural discretion. She'd been watching Bo write in his leather journal each evening, his weathered hands surprisingly graceful as they moved across the page. When he left one morning to check his distant trap lines, she found herself drawn to the worn book he'd left beside his chair. She knew she shouldn't. A person's private writings were sacred territory, not to be trespassed upon without permission. But something about the careful way he tended to that journal, the obvious years of accumulated entries, made her desperately curious about the thoughts and observations he committed to paper each night. The first page stopped her breath entirely. Written in a clear, educated hand was not the crude record-keeping she'd expected, but elegant prose that would have been at home in any Eastern drawing room. The light this morning was particularly fine, slanting through the pines at an angle that transformed ordinary ice into prisms of color. I found myself thinking how poorly our language serves to capture such moments. We have words for beauty, but they are blunt instruments compared to the precise wonder of creation observed in solitude. She turned the page, then another, finding entries that revealed a man of deep thoughtfulness and surprising philosophical bent. He wrote about the changing seasons with the precision of a naturalist and the soul of a poet. He recorded conversations with the Blackfoot traders who passed through, demonstrating not just fluency in their language, but genuine respect for their perspective on the land and its rhythms. But it was an entry from the previous week that made her sink into his chair with a soft gasp. She improves daily, though she doesn't realize how closely I watch for signs of lingering weakness from her ordeal. There's a determined tilt to her chin when she tackles unfamiliar tasks that speaks to the strength that carried her to my door. I find myself wondering what she thinks of this crude life, whether the refinement that clings to her like expensive perfume rebels against the simplicity of our days. Strange how quickly one becomes accustomed to sharing space with another soul. The cabin feels different now, more alive somehow, as if her presence has awakened corners that had been sleeping for years. Find anything interesting? She spun around to find Bo standing in the doorway, arms crossed, but his expression was more amused than angry. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized she'd been caught red-handed in her trespass. "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have. I was just curious about—" She gestured helplessly at the journal. "You write beautifully. Surprised you did it?" He moved to the stove and poured himself coffee, seemingly unbothered by her discovery. Most folks figure a mountain hermit can barely scratch out his own name. "That's exactly what I thought," she admitted, closing the journal and setting it carefully on the table. "I assumed you were just recording practical things, weather, game sightings, supply needs. I do that too, but up here, with nothing but your own thoughts for company most of the time, you either learn to find meaning in small things or you go mad from the emptiness." She studied his face, seeing him with new eyes. "You weren't always a mountain man." It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. "No, I was Jacob Beauregard Callahan once upon a time, son of a Virginia planter, educated at William and Mary, expected to take over the family holdings and marry well and produce the next generation of proper Southern gentlemen." "What happened?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, tarnished objector daguerreotype in a cracked silver frame. He handed it to her without a word. The photograph showed a younger Beau, clean-shaven and formally dressed, standing behind a beautiful woman seated in an ornate chair. She was holding a baby, perhaps 6 months old, and beside her stood a boy of maybe 3 years. All of them were smiling, and the love between them was palpable, even in the formal constraints of the photograph. "My wife, Catherine," Beau said quietly. "My sons, Thomas and baby James." Rosalind looked up from the photograph with dawning understanding and sympathy. The fever, cholera, swept through Richmond in the summer of 1858. Catherine and the baby died within days of each other. Thomas lasted another week. His voice was steady, but she could see the old pain still etched in the lines around his eyes. "I buried them in the family plot, sat through the condolences and casseroles, tried to go back to managing the plantation like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Everything that mattered was gone. I'd wake up expecting to hear Catherine humming in the kitchen or Thomas chattering about his lessons. I'd catch myself setting 4 places at the table, buying candy in town for boys who would never taste it." He took the photograph back, studying it with the careful attention of a man who'd memorized every detail. "After about 6 months of that, I realized I was either going to drink myself to death or put a bullet in my brain. So I sold everything, bought supplies, and headed west. And you've been alone ever since. 15 years come spring, and it was good, mostly. Honest work, clean air, no ghosts lurking in familiar rooms." He looked at her then with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Until you showed up and reminded me what it felt like to care about another person's comfort more than my own." The confession hung between them, heavy with implication. Rosalind felt her heart racing as she processed not just his words, but the careful way he was watching her reaction. "Beau, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know what I am, what this life is. I'm not fool enough to think a woman like you would choose this permanently. But while you're here, while we're—" He gestured at the space between them, at the domestic intimacy that had grown so naturally. "I wanted you to know that it means something, that you mean something." Instead of answering with words, she rose from the chair and crossed to where he stood. The photograph was still in his hands, and she covered them with her own, looking down at the family he'd lost. "They were beautiful," she said softly. "You were happy." "I was. Different kind of happy than I'd ever imagined I could be again until—" He stopped himself, but she heard the implication anyway. "Until?" His free hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Until I found myself imagining what it would be like to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more certain, flavored with the knowledge of what they were both risking by allowing this feeling to grow. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Rosalind could see her own want reflected in his dark eyes. "I don't know what happens when spring comes," she whispered against his lips. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this life, or if you'd be happy with someone who brings so much trouble to your door." "I don't know either," he admitted, "but I know I'd rather face those questions with you than face anything else alone." That night, they sat together on his small sofa, her head on his shoulder as he read aloud from one of the few books he owned, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that seemed fitting for a man who'd learned to find the sacred in the everyday. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to fall, but inside their small sanctuary, something precious and fragile was blooming despite the harsh season. "Rosalind? I'm glad you looked at my journal." She tilted her head to see his face, surprised. "You are? It saved me from having to find the courage to tell you all that myself." His arm tightened around her. "Though next time, maybe just ask. I've got nothing left to hide from you." The trust implicit in that statement settled over her like a warm blanket. For the first time since she'd fled her old life, she felt the possibility of a future that held more than just escape. Here, in this rough cabin with this unexpectedly gentleman, she was discovering what it might mean to truly come home. The first signs of spring's approach came not with warmth, but with subtle changes in the light and the behavior of the mountain's creatures. Snow still lay deep around the cabin, but the quality of it had changeless powder, more the heavy wetness that spoke of eventual thaw. Ravens called from the pine tops with different voices, and Rex began ranging farther from the cabin during their daily walks, nose twitching at scents carried on warming winds. "Won't be long now," Bo said one morning as he studied the sky from the cabin's front step. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the main trail will start to clear." Rosalind, who was hanging wash on the line he'd strung between 2 posts, went very still. They'd been living in a kind of suspended time, focused on the daily rhythms of survival and the growing intimacy between them. The future had seemed safely distant, something to be dealt with when it arrived. But spring's approach brought with it questions neither of them was quite ready to face. "The trail to where?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Civilization, town, the world beyond this mountain." He came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, even as his words stirred up uncertainty. "Time to start thinking about what comes next." She finished hanging his shirt, smoothing out the wrinkles with unnecessary care. "What do you think should come next?" "I think," he said carefully, "that decision isn't mine to make alone." They'd grown closer over the past weeks, sharing not just space but confidences, small intimacies, a few more kisses that left them both wanting things they weren't quite ready to name. But they'd also been careful to maintain certain boundaries, sleeping in separate spaces, never quite acknowledging the current of desire that ran beneath their daily interactions. "Bo, I need to tell you something," she said, suddenly turning to face him, "about my life before, about what I'm really running from." His expression grew serious. "All right. Marcus Thornfield isn't just wealthy. His family has connections throughout the territory, business partnerships with men who aren't particular about how they collect debts or settle scores. When I ran, I didn't just embarrass him socially. I cost him a substantial dowry and a business alliance he'd been counting on." She could see him processing this information, understanding the implications. How substantial? $50,000 and a railroad contract that would have made him one of the most powerful men in the territory. Her voice dropped. "He won't just let that go, Bo. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. Men like him also don't usually venture far from their comfortable offices and private clubs." But even as he said it, she could see the worry creeping into his eyes. "You think he'd really send people this far into the mountains?" "I think he'd send them to the ends of the earth if that's what it took to get his property back." His property. The words came out flat. Dangerous. That's how he sees me. How men like him see all women as assets to be acquired and managed. She reached for his hand, needing the connection. I won't let him hurt you because of me. If there's any sign... Stop. His grip on her hand tightened. We've had this conversation before. You're not going anywhere. But if... Rosalind. His free hand came up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Do you trust me? Of course I do. Then trust me to keep you safe. Trust me to know what I can handle. His thumb traced along her cheekbone. And trust me when I say that no Eastern dandy and his hired thugs are going to take you away from me. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but she'd lived too long with fear to dismiss it easily. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what kind of men. I know exactly what kind of men. Something cold and hard had entered his expression. You think I spent 15 years up here just trapping and trading? You think the Blackfoot taught me their language because I was friendly? She studied his face, seeing something she'd missed before, a certain watchfulness, a way of holding himself that spoke of experience with violence. What aren't you telling me? Same thing you weren't telling me about Thornfield's connections, I suppose. He released her face but kept hold of her hand. There are things in my past that have nothing to do with plantation life or family fever. Things that might come in handy if trouble finds its way up this mountain. Before she could ask what he meant, he was leading her toward the cabin. Come on. If we're going to have this conversation, we might as well have it properly. Inside, he went to the old army trunk that served as both storage and table beside his bed. She'd seen him take clothes from it, but never paid attention to what else it might contain. Now he lifted the heavy lid and began removing items from the bottom. A gun belt with a well-worn holster, a rifle she'd never seen before, and a small wooden box that clinked softly when he moved it. My father's rifle, he said, indicating the weapon she'd seen him carry. This one's mine. The rifle he lifted from the trunk was different from his father's hunting weapon, sleeker, more modern, with modifications that spoke of serious use. The gun belt held a revolver that showed similar signs of careful maintenance and regular handling. Bow? He opened the wooden box to reveal ammunition, but also something else, small metal badge, tarnished with age. She leaned closer to read the inscription, U.S. Marshal, Western District. You were a lawman. For 3 years after I left Virginia, figured if I was going to be miserable anyway, might as well do something useful with it. He picked up the badge, turning it over in his hands. Spent most of my time tracking men who thought the wilderness was a good place to hide from justice. Men like the ones Thornfield might send. The implications of this revelation settled over her slowly. That's why you're so sure you can handle whatever comes. I'm sure because I've handled worse. And because, he looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Because I've never had anything worth fighting for the way I'd fight for you. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with promise and declaration. Before she could respond, he was moving again, returning the weapons to their resting place, but keeping the rifle out. Time you learned to use this properly, he said, just in case. I don't know if I could. Not asking you to kill anyone, but you should know how to defend yourself if it comes to that. He checked the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Besides, it's a useful skill up here regardless. Game, predators, there's plenty of reasons a mountain woman should know her way around a weapon. A mountain woman. The phrase sent a little thrill through her, as if he were offering her an identity she hadn't known she wanted. They spent the afternoon on what he called shooting lessons, though it felt more like a carefully choreographed dance of trust and intimacy. His hands covered hers as he showed her how to hold the rifle, his body pressed against her back as he helped her aim. His voice, low and patient in her ear, guided her through the mechanics of loading and firing. Breathe in, let half out, then squeeze, don't pull, squeeze the trigger. His breath was warm against her neck, sending shivers that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. When she finally hit the target he'd set up against a distant pine, the crack of the rifle echoing off the mountainsides, she felt a surge of pride and accomplishment, unlike anything she'd experienced in her carefully sheltered life. Good shot, he said, and the approval in his voice warmed her more than any praise she'd received for her embroidery or piano playing ever had. It's harder than it looks. Most worthwhile things are. He took the rifle from her hands, but instead of stepping away, he remained close, studying her face. You're stronger than you know, Rosalind. Stronger than he ever let you believe you were. The kiss that followed was inevitable, born of shared trust and the intimacy of the lesson, but also of something deeper, a recognition that they were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance, but partners choosing to face whatever came next together. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she could see her own desire reflected in his dark eyes. But there was something else there, true restraint, the careful control of a man who wouldn't push for more than she was ready to give. Rosalind, he said, her name a question and a promise. I know, she whispered, understanding what he wasn't quite asking. I know, and too want that too. But I need to know that when you look at me, you see me. Not some idealized version of femininity, not a replacement for what you lost, not a project to be protected and sheltered. Just me. His hands came up to frame her face, and the tenderness in his touch nearly undid her. I see a woman who walked into a blizzard rather than submit to a life that would have broken her spirit. I see someone who learned to split wood and build fires and shoot straight because those skills mattered to her survival. I see someone brave enough to trust a stranger, strong enough to start over, stubborn enough to argue with me when she thinks I'm wrong, his thumb traced along her jawline. I see you, Rosalind Hart, exactly as you are. That night, as they sat by the fire, sharing their simple supper, the awareness between them had shifted again. They were no longer just sheltering together, waiting for spring. They were building something, choosing something, committing to something that would outlast the winter and the danger that might follow. What happens if they do come? She asked as they prepared for bed. If Marcus sends men looking for me? Bo checked the locks on the door and shutters. A ritual she'd noticed had become more thorough since their conversation about Thornfield's connections. Then they'll find out what happens when someone threatens my family. Family. The word settled over her like a warm quilt, bringing with it possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Here, in this rough cabin with this complicated gentleman, she was discovering what it meant to belong somewhere completely, to be valued for who she was rather than what she represented. Outside, the wind carried hints of the coming thaw, but inside, something precious and permanent was taking root. 3 weeks later, Rosalind discovered she'd been writing letters she never intended to send. It started as a way to process her thoughts during the long winter evenings while Bo worked on various repairs and projects. She'd found paper and ink among his supplies, practical items for a man who kept detailed records of weather and game. Pat and Sand began writing to her sister Margaret in Boston, trying to explain the inexplicable transformation her life had undergone. Dearest Margaret, one letter began, I know you must think me dead or mad to have vanished so completely, but I hope someday you'll understand that I had to choose between dying slowly in a gilded cage or taking my chances with honest wildness. I found both love and myself in the most unlikely place. She never finished that letter, or any of the others. How could she explain Bo to someone who'd never ventured beyond the drawing rooms of proper society? How could she describe the deep satisfaction of days spent in useful labor, the peace of evenings without social obligations, the way her heart raced every time he looked at her with those dark, knowing eyes? But writing the letters helped her understand her own feelings, helped her recognize how completely her old life had fallen away like a snake's discarded skin. The woman who'd once fretted over which gloves to wear to morning calls seemed like a stranger now. This new version of herself, capable and strong and deeply, impossibly in love, felt more real than she'd ever been. What are you always scribbling about over there? Bo asked one evening as he worked on repairing a broken snowshoe. Letters to my family, though I don't suppose I'll ever send them. Why not? She set down her pen and considered the question. What would I say? That I've fallen in love with a mountain hermit? That I've discovered I'm happier splitting wood and cooking over a fire than I ever was planning dinner parties and managing servants. You could start with telling them you're alive and safe. They probably assume I'm dead by now. It might be kinder to let them keep thinking that than to tell them the truth about what I've chosen. He looked up from his work, studying her with that careful attention she'd come to both crave and fear. What have you chosen, Rosalind? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications they'd been dancing around for weeks. She could feel her heart beating faster as she considered how to answer. I've chosen you, she said simply. This life, this place, you. I've chosen all of it. The snowshoe fell from his hands as he stared at her. You sure about that? Because once spring comes, once the pass is clear, you'll have other options. You could go anywhere, start fresh, where no one knows your history. She rose from the table and crossed to where he sat, taking his face in her hands the way he'd done to her so many times. I don't want other options. I want this. I want you. Even knowing what it means, living up here, cut off from everything you've known, no society, no culture, no expectations except the ones we set for ourselves. No pretense, no performance, no measuring my worth by how well I ornament someone else's life. She stroked her thumbs along his cheekbones. Bo, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong. The kiss that followed was different from all the others, deeper, more urgent, flavored with decision and commitment. When they broke apart, she could see something had shifted in his expression, a wall coming down that she hadn't even realized was still there. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Something I should have said weeks ago. What? I love you. The words came out like a confession, like something that had been building pressure behind his ribs for so long that releasing it left him breathless. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you attack every new challenge like it's a personal insult. I love how you've made this place feel like a home instead of just a shelter. I love. She silenced him with another kiss, pouring her own feelings into the connection. When they separated, both were breathing hard. I love you too, she whispered against his lips. I think I have since the moment you carried me inside, and I saw gentleness in your eyes, instead of the cruelty I'd learned to expect from men. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. Not physically, they still maintained separate sleeping spaces, though the careful distance between them had narrowed considerably, but emotionally. The last walls between them had crumbled, leaving them open and vulnerable and completely committed to whatever future they could build together. The next morning brought visitors. Bo was splitting wood behind the cabin when Rex began barking in the aggressive tone he reserved for strangers. Through the window, Rosalind could see 3 riders picking their way carefully up the snowy trail, their horses blowing steam in the cold air. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the quality of their clothes, the purposeful way they rode despite the difficult conditions. Bo, she called, proud that her voice remained steady. We have company. He appeared at her shoulder within seconds, and she felt some of her panic ease at his calm assessment of the situation. Friends of yours? I don't think so. Then they're not getting a warm welcome. He was already moving, checking the loads in his rifle and the revolver at his hip. Get away from the windows. There's a rifle behind the bed, loaded and ready. What are you going to do? Talk to them. See what they want and how reasonable they're feeling about it. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that was both tender and fierce. Rosalind, whatever happens, know that I meant every word I said last night. Then he was outside, Rex at his side, moving with the controlled confidence of a man who'd faced dangerous situations before. Through the crack in the shutters, she could see him positioning himself in the yard, rifle held casually but ready, every line of his body speaking of competence and control. The riders stopped at the edge of the clearing, and the leader, a tall man in an expensive coat that looked ridiculously out of place in the wilderness, called out a greeting that was polite on the surface but edged with threat. Morning, friend. We're looking for someone, and we heard you might be able to help us. Depends on who you're looking for and why, Bo replied, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Young lady goes by Rosalind Hart. About 25, dark hair, pretty. Her family's worried sick about her. Even from inside the cabin, Rosalind could hear the lie in the man's voice. But Beau's response was perfect, confused, helpful, exactly what a simple mountain man would say. Can't say I've seen anyone like that. Don't get many visitors up here, especially not ladies. That's strange, the man continued, and now the threat was more open. Because we tracked her this far, and there's nowhere else she could have gone. Maybe she doubled back. Easy to get turned around in country like this. There was a long pause, and Rosalind could see the men exchanging glances. Then the leader's voice changed, became harder. See, the thing is, we know she's here, and we're not leaving without her. Beau's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, but she caught it, the settling of weight, the minute adjustment of his grip on the rifle. Well then, I guess we have a problem. The morning quiet shattered as everything changed at once. The confrontation in the yard ended faster than it began. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, 2 from the riders, 1 from Beau, and when the gun smoke cleared, 1 man lay motionless in the snow, while the other 2 spurred their horses back down the mountain, abandoning their fallen companion without a backward glance. Beau stood where he'd been, rifle still raised, Rex growling low beside him. But Rosalind could see blood seeping through his shirt sleeve, and her heart nearly stopped. Beau! She was out the door and running to him before he could tell her to stay inside. I'm all right, he said, though his face was pale. Just a graze. The dead man lay sprawled beside his horse, expensive clothes already dusting with snow. Beau approached carefully, rifle ready, but it was clear the threat was over. He knelt and began searching through the man's pockets while Rosalind pressed her apron against his wounded arm. What are you looking for? Answers. He pulled out a leather portfolio and flipped it open. What he found there made his expression go hard and dangerous. Well, hell. What is it? Instead of answering immediately, he continued searching, pulling out a small stack of papers that made his jaw clench with each one he examined. Finally, he stood and handed her the portfolio. Your Mr. Thornfield has been busy. The first document was a wanted poster, but not the crude handbill she'd expected. This was an official notice printed on quality paper, complete with an engraved portrait that was a fair likeness of her face and a description that was disturbingly accurate. But it was the charges listed that made her blood run cold. Wanted, Rosalind Margaret Hart. Theft of property valued at 75. 0. Assault with intent to kill. Armed robbery. Destruction of property. Known to be dangerous and unstable. 5. 0 reward for return. Dead or alive. Beau, this is all lies. I know. His voice was grim as he handed her the next paper. But look at this. It was a letter of authorization, bearing official seals and signatures that looked disturbingly authentic. It appointed Marcus Thornfield as a special territorial marshal with the authority to pursue and apprehend fugitives across state and territorial lines. The document granted him the power to deputize agents and use whatever force necessary to bring criminals to justice. He bought himself a badge, Beau said flatly, made himself a lawman so he could hunt you legally. The third document made her knees weak. It was a detailed report on Beau himself, complete with his real name, his history as a federal marshal, and even a rough sketch of his cabin's location. Someone had been asking questions, lots of them, and they'd gotten answers that should have been impossible to find. How did they know all this? Money talks, and Thornfield's got plenty of it. Beau was already moving, gathering up the papers and shoving them into his coat. We need to get inside. Those 2 that ran aren't going to give up, they're going back for reinforcements. Inside the cabin, he moved with purpose, pulling out his old marshal's gear and checking weapons with professional efficiency. The wounded arm didn't seem to slow him down, though she could see pain tightening the corners of his eyes. Let me tend that, she said, reaching for his injured arm. Later. Right now we need to figure out how much time we have before they come back with an army. He spread the papers on the table, studying them like a general planning, a campaign. This changes everything, Rosalind. He's not just some angry fiancé anymore. He's made this official. Even if we killed every man he sends, more would come. The law would be on his side. But it's all lies. Doesn't matter. Truth is what's written on the warrant, and according to this, you're a dangerous criminal who needs to be brought to justice. He looked up at her with an expression that mixed love and desperation. We can't fight the law, sweetheart, not when he's written it himself. The full implications of their situation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. What are you saying? I'm saying running isn't enough anymore. Hiding isn't enough. As long as Thornfield's alive and has those connections, you'll never be safe anywhere in the territories. She sank into a chair, the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her shoulders. Then what do we do? Bo was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers as if they might yield some solution she couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. We disappear. What do you mean? I mean we stage your death. Make it look like you died up here in the mountains avalanche, maybe, or a fall. Something that would leave no body to find but enough evidence to convince them you're gone for good. The idea was so audacious it took her breath away. That could work? It's worked before. I've helped other people start over with new identities when their old lives became too dangerous to keep. He met her eyes, and she could see the pain this decision cost him. But it would mean leaving here, forever. We could never come back, never contact anyone from our old lives. We'd have to become completely different people. Where would we go? California, maybe. Or up to Oregon Territory. Somewhere far enough away that no one would think to look, where we could homestead under new names and build a life from scratch. The sacrifice this would require wasn't lost on her. This cabin, this mountain, this carefully built life of Hish was offering to give up everything for her safety. Bo, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing. He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Rosalind, I told you I'd never had anything worth fighting for the way I'd fight for you. But I'd rather run to the ends of the earth with you than fight a war I can't win and lose you anyway. What about your life here? 15 years you've built this place. 15 years I spent surviving, not living. You've shown me the difference. His grip on her hands tightened. This cabin, this mountain, none of it means anything without you in it. Outside, Rex began barking again, the sharp warning bark that meant more strangers approaching. Through the shuttered windows, they could hear the sound of multiple horses, more than the two that had fled earlier. Decision time, Bo said, already reaching for his rifle. Do we make our stand here, or do we start running and never stop? Rosalind looked around the cabin that had become her first real home, at the man who'd saved her in every way that mattered, at the simple life they'd built together that was about to be destroyed by forces beyond their control. How do we fake my death? His smile was fierce and proud. Leave that to me. But first, we need to survive the next few hours. The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and with it came the certain knowledge that their quiet winter together was over. Whatever came next would test everything they'd built, everything they'd promised each other, everything they were willing to sacrifice for love. But as Bo checked his weapons and Rosalind took her position at the window with the rifle he'd taught her to use, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, but determination. They'd found each other against all odds, built something precious in the midst of nothing. Now they'd defend it with everything they had, and if they couldn't defend it, they'd carry it with them wherever the running took them. Outside, the sound of horses stopped, replaced by men's voices calling out demands and threats. Inside, two people who'd learned to trust each other, completely prepared to face whatever came next, together. 6 riders had returned, and from their positioning around the cabin, it was clear they'd learned caution from their companion's death. They stayed well back from the windows, using the trees for cover, while their leader, not Marcus himself, but a hard-faced man with the look of someone accustomed to violence, called out his demands. Callahan, we know you're in there, and we know you've got the woman. This doesn't have to end badly for you. Bo positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready, while Rosalind covered the back approach. The wound in his arm had been bandaged quickly, but she could see it was still bleeding, the white cloth already stained red. "What's your offer?" Bo called back, playing for time while he assessed their tactical situation. "You hand over Rosalind Hart, and we'll let you walk away. Hell, there might even be something in it for you, Mr. Thornfields, a generous man to those who cooperate. And if I don't, then we'll burn you out and take her anyway. Your choice, how hard this has to be." Bo glanced at Rosalind, and she could see him calculating odds, distances, possibilities. 6 men, well-armed and positioned with military precision. Even with his experience and knowledge of the terrain, those weren't favorable numbers. "I need an hour to think about it," Bo shouted. "You've got 30 minutes, then we start shooting." As soon as the voices outside died down, Bo was in motion, gathering supplies with quick efficiency. "They're not going to wait 30 minutes, he said quietly. "That was just to make us think we had time to panic." "What's the plan?" "We make them think you're dead. Then we get out of here before they figure out the trick." He pulled his old marshal's badge from the trunk, along with a small leather pouch that clinked with coins. "There's a back trail that leads to a box canyon about 2 miles north. If we can get there, I can trigger a small avalanche that'll block the entrance for weeks. You can do that? There's an overhang that's been ready to fall for years. Little dynamite in the right place, and the whole face will come down." He moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pried it up, revealing a small cache of supplies, including several sticks of the explosive. Miners aren't the only ones who find uses for this stuff. The plan he outlined was desperate but clever. They would stage a fight that ended with her falling through the ice of the creek that ran behind the cabin. In the confusion, she would slip away to a predetermined meeting point while he convinced their attackers that she'd drowned in the freezing water. "What about you? How do you get away?" "I don't at first. I play the grieving lover. Let them search the creek, maybe even help them look for your body. When they're convinced you're dead, they'll probably leave me alone. I'm not worth the trouble if you're gone. And then I wait a day or two and follow the trail to meet you. By the time they realize what happened, we'll be long gone." It was a good plan, but it depended on split-second timing and no small amount of luck. If any of the armed men got too close a look at the deception, if the creek wasn't as concealing as Bo hoped, if any of a dozen things went wrong. "There's something else," he said, interrupting her worried calculations. He was kneeling beside his trunk again, but this time what he pulled out made her breath catch. It was a ring knot, expensive or elaborate, but beautiful in its simplicity, a thin band of gold with a small stone that caught the firelight and threw it back in warm sparkles. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "I know this isn't exactly the romantic proposal you probably dreamed of, but, Bo, I mean, we might not live through the next hour, and I can't stand the thought that you might die not knowing that I want to spend whatever time we have left as your husband." She was crying now, though she couldn't say when the tears had started. "Yes. Yes? Yes, you foolish, wonderful man. Of course, yes." She held out her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that shook only slightly. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years just for her. "I wish we had time for a proper ceremony," he said, bringing her hand to his lips to kiss the ring. "We'll have time later. We'll have all the time in the world." She cupped his face with her free hand, memorizing every line and angle. "I love you, Jacob Beauregard Callahan." "I love you too, Mrs. Callahan." The sound of men moving outside broke the spell. Through the shuttered windows, they could see shapes shifting position, getting ready for whatever came next. "Time to go," Bo said, shouldering his pack and checking his weapons one final time. "You remember the plan? Run to the creek, make a lot of noise, fall through the ice, stay under as long as I can, then slip downstream to the big boulder and hide until you come find me. And if I don't come, you'll come." She said it with complete certainty, the kind of faith that comes from absolute trust. "You'll come because you promised, and you've never broken a promise to me." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, and full of all the things they might not live to say to each other. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, but their eyes were steady. Ready? Ready. Bo kicked open the front door and started shooting, laying down, covering fire, while shouting curses and accusations. The men outside returned fire immediately, bullets splintering the doorframe and whining past their heads. In the chaos, Rosalind slipped out the back door and ran toward the creek, making enough noise to ensure she'd be seen and followed. Behind her, she could hear Bo's voice raised in anguish. "You killed her! You bastards killed her!" More gunshots, the sound of splintering wood, men shouting orders. She reached the creek bank just as the first pursuer rounded the cabin, his rifle raised and ready. There she is. Rosalind didn't have to fake the desperation in her voice as she screamed Bo's name, didn't have to pretend the terror as she stepped onto the thin ice covering the creek's edge. The ice cracked ominously under her weight, spider webbing outward from where she stood. "Don't shoot her, you fool. Thornfield wants her alive." But it was too late to matter. The ice gave way with a sharp crack that echoed off the mountain walls, and Rosalind disappeared into the rushing water with a scream that was only half feigned. The creek was every bit as cold as she'd feared, the shock of it driving the air from her lungs and setting her heart hammering. But she'd grown up swimming in the ponds of her father's estate, and she forced herself to stay calm, to let the current carry her downstream while she held her breath and prayed Bo's plan would work. Above the water, she could hear shouting, cursing, the sound of men crashing through the underbrush along the creek bank. Someone was yelling orders about ropes and poles, trying to organize a rescue effort. But by the time they got organized, she was already 100 yards downstream, pulling herself out of the water behind the boulder Bo had designated as their meeting point. Soaked, freezing, but alive and free. Now all she had to do was wait and trust that the man she'd just married would find a way to join her. The deception held for exactly 27 minutes. Rosalind waited behind the boulder, shivering in her wet clothes, listening to the sounds of the search party working their way along the creek. She could hear Bo's voice among them, playing his part perfectly, the distraught lover desperate to find his woman's body, offering to help search, suggesting places where she might have gotten caught in the current. Then the voices changed, became sharper, more suspicious. Someone had found something, or noticed something, or simply gotten too good a look at the scene. The tone of command shifted, and she heard a new voice, cultured, educated, coldly furious. Marcus Thornfield had arrived. "You lying bastard," came the familiar voice that still had the power to make her blood run cold. "Did you really think I was stupid enough to fall for this pathetic charade?" Bo's response was carefully confused, still playing his role. "What are you talking about? She fell through the ice. We all saw it happen." "What I saw was a very convenient accident that happened to occur just when my men had you cornered." Thornfield's voice was getting closer, and with growing horror, Rosalind realized he was leading the search in her direction. "James, what did you find?" "Tracks, sir, leading away from the water, fresh ones. Someone pulled themselves out right about here." Her heart stopped. She'd been careful, but wet boots in snow left unmistakable signs. Within minutes, they'd track her to the boulder. "Fan out," Thornfield ordered. "She's close. And bring Mr. Callahan with us. I want him to see what happens to men who lie to me." Rosalind pressed herself against the cold stone, mind racing through limited options. She could run, but they'd track her easily in the snow. She could try to circle back toward the cabin, but that would just trap her in the same dead end Bo had been trying to get her out of. She could... A hand clamped over her mouth from behind, and she nearly screamed before she recognized the familiar calloused palm, the particular scent of wood smoke and pine that meant safety. "Shh," Bo breathed in her ear. "It's me." He'd somehow slipped away from the search party and made it to her hiding place. But she could see from his grim expression that their situation had gone from desperate to hopeless. "How many?" she whispered. 8 now. Thornfield brought more men. His arm was around her, and she could feel the tension in his body, the coiled readiness of a man preparing for violence. "He's not buying the drowning story. What do we do?" Before he could answer, Marcus Thornfield's voice cut through the mountain air like a blade. "Rosalind, darling, I know you're out there. Why don't you save everyone a lot of trouble and come out? We can discuss this like civilized people. The false endearment, the mock reasonable tone, it all came flooding back. The suffocating weight of his control, the way he'd made every conversation feel like a trap. But she wasn't the same frightened woman who'd fled his house in the middle of the night. That woman would have considered surrendering, would have weighed the costs of resistance against the certainty of his retaliation. This woman, Beau's woman, the mountain woman she'd become, had learned a different kind of math. "Go to hell, Marcus," she called back, and had the satisfaction of hearing startled cursing from multiple directions. "Such language, my dear. The mountains have been a terrible influence on you." His voice was moving again, getting closer. "Mr. Callahan, I hope you understand that your little performance has cost you any consideration I might have shown. When I find you, and I will find you, you're going to wish you'd taken my generous offer." Beau's grip on his rifle tightened, and she could see him calculating angles, distances, the tactical nightmare of being outnumbered 4-1 in terrain that offered limited cover. "Listen to me," he said quietly, his lips against her ear. "There's a game trail that leads up to the ridge, starts about 50 yards north of here. If you can get to it without being seen, I'm not leaving you." "Rosalind." "No." She turned in his arms to face him fully, and the determination in her eyes stopped his protest. "We do this together or not at all. I won't spend the rest of my life wondering if you died because I was too much of a coward to stand with you. It's not about courage, it's about keeping you alive. What's the point of staying alive if I lose everything that makes life worth living?" She gripped his coat, holding him close. "You said you'd never had anything worth fighting for the way you'd fight for me. Well, I've never had anything worth dying for the way I'd die for you." For a moment, something that might have been pride warred with desperation in his expression. Then he nodded, the short, sharp movement of a man accepting an inevitable truth. "All right, we make our stand here. Here. Best defensive position we're going to get. The boulder gives us cover. The creek at our backs limits their approach angles." He was already moving, checking sightlines and preparing positions. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." The sound of men moving through the underbrush was getting closer. Soon they'd be close enough to spot the hiding place, and the talking would be over. "Beau? Yeah? I love you. I need you to know that, whatever happens next." He kissed her then, quick and fierce, tasting of determination and desperation in equal measure. "I love you too, Mrs. Callahan. And I'm going to make damn sure we live long enough for you to get used to that name." The first muzzle flash lit up the trees to their east, followed immediately by the crack of a rifle and the whine of a bullet ricocheting off stone. The battle for their life together had begun, and there would be no quarter asked or given on either side. But as Rosalind raised her own rifle and sighted down the barrel at shapes moving through the forest, she felt something she hadn't expected, not fear, but a fierce, bright joy. She was exactly where she belonged, fighting beside the man she loved for the right to build a life together. Whatever the outcome, she would face it without regret. The mountain morning erupted in gunfire, and the real test of everything they'd built together began. The gunfight lasted 17 minutes, though it felt like hours to Rosalind as she crouched behind the boulder, rifle bucking against her shoulder each time she fired. Beau had been right about the tactical advantages of their position. The creek behind them meant their enemies could only approach from 3 sides, and the boulder provided solid cover from the heaviest fire. But 8 against 2 were still impossible odds, and Marcus Thornfield proved to be as ruthless as he was persistent. While some of his men kept up steady fire to pin them down, others worked their way around the flanks, using the thick pine forest to mask their movement. "Left side," Beau called out, and Rosalind swung her rifle toward movement in the trees. Her shot went wide, but it was close enough to send the man diving for cover. "How many rounds do you have left?" She checked her ammunition pouch, heart sinking at what she found. 6. "I've got 4. He fired twice in quick succession, and she heard a cry of pain from the forest. That evens the odds a little. But even as he said it, they both knew the mathematics of the situation were unchanged. They couldn't sustain this kind of firefight much longer, and when their ammunition ran out, the men surrounding them would close in for the finish. That's when Marcus made his mistake. "Enough!" His voice cut through the gunfire, commanding and imperious. "Cease fire! All of you, stop shooting immediately!" The forest went quiet except for the sound of the creek running behind them. Rosalind could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the acrid scent of gunpowder and her own fear sweat. "Rosalind, my dear, this has gone on quite long enough." Marcus stepped into view, hands raised to show he wasn't holding a weapon, though she could see the bulge of a concealed pistol beneath his expensive coat. "You're being very unreasonable about this entire situation." He looked exactly as she remembered it, handsome in a cold sort of way, impeccably dressed, even in the wilderness. But now she could see things she'd missed before, or perhaps hadn't let herself acknowledge. The cruelty around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to absolute obedience, the complete absence of any warmth or genuine emotion. "I'm being unreasonable?" She kept her rifle trained on his chest. "You've turned me into a wanted criminal with lies, bought yourself a marshal's badge, and followed me into the mountains with an army. But I'm the unreasonable one? You stole from me, Rosalind, $75,000 in dowry money, plus the railroad contracts your father signed over as part of our engagement agreement. Did you think there would be no consequences for such actions? I didn't steal anything. I refused to marry a man who showed his true nature by trying to rape me." Marcus's expression darkened. "Such dramatic language. I was simply claiming what was already mine by right. A man has certain expectations regarding his intended bride." Beside her, she felt Bo go very still, the kind of dangerous stillness that preceded explosive violence. But when he spoke, his voice was conversational, almost friendly. "You know what I find interesting, Thornfield? A man who has to buy a badge to make himself feel important. A man who needs 8 armed thugs to help him intimidate one woman." He shifted slightly, and Rosalind realized he was positioning himself for a clear shot. "Makes a person wonder what else about him might be lacking." "You're hardly in a position to insult me, Callahan. In about 2 minutes you're going to be dead, and Rosalind will be coming home with me to face the consequences of her choices. That assumes we don't kill you first." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the mountain walls. "With what? You're almost out of ammunition, outnumbered, and trapped. The only question is whether you surrender now and die quickly, or whether I let my men have some fun with you first." That's when Rosalind saw it, the small stick of dynamite Bo had palmed from his pack, the friction match in his other hand. He caught her eye and nodded toward the slope above them, where snow clung precariously to an overhanging ledge. She understood immediately. The avalanche he'd planned to use to block their escape route was going to bring it down on their attackers instead. It was desperate, dangerous, and might well kill them all, but it was the only chance they had. "Marcus," she called out, keeping her voice steady while Bo prepared the charge. "You're right about one thing. This has gone on long enough." Finally, some sense. "If you surrender now, I might even be merciful about your mountain man's punishment." "I'm not surrendering." She raised her rifle, sighting directly at his heart. "I'm choosing." The shot that rang out wasn't hers. Bo had lit the dynamite and thrown it in one smooth motion, the small charge arcing through the air to land against the snow-heavy ledge above the forest where Marcus's men were positioned. The explosion, when it came, was enormous in the confines of the narrow valley. The mountainside came down in a thunderous roar of snow, ice, and broken trees. Marcus's scream was cut short as the white wall swept over him, carrying away man and forest and leaving only churning chaos where moments before there had been solid ground. Rosalind and Bo pressed themselves against their boulder as the avalanche swept past, filling the air with snow and the deafening sound of destruction. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was profound and complete. They were alone. The forest where Marcus Thornfield and his men had been was gone, buried under tons of snow and debris. Nothing moved in the white wasteland that stretched before them, and no sounds came from beneath the packed ice. "Are they?" Rosalind couldn't finish the question. "Dead," Bo's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. All of them. Nobody survives something like that. She should have felt something: relief, triumph, guilt, something. Instead, there was only a strange emptiness where her fear had been, as if some vital part of her had been holding its breath for so long that she'd forgotten how to exhale. "It's over," she said, testing the words to see if they felt true. "It's over." He pulled her against him, and she could feel the tremor in his hands, the delayed reaction to how close they'd come to dying. "He can't hurt you anymore. No one can." But even as she melted into his embrace, even as she felt the deep relief of survival and safety, she couldn't help looking at the destruction they'd caused. Somewhere under all that snow lay the remains of the life she'd fled, the man who'd tried to own her, the threat that had driven them to this desperate place. The cabin they'd shared, the peaceful winter they'd built together, the gentle courtship that had bloomed into love, all of it was gone now, buried as surely as Marcus Thornfield was buried under the avalanche. They were alive, they were together, they were free. But they were also homeless, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a long, dangerous journey ahead of them to whatever new life they could build from the ashes of the old. Standing in the aftermath of violence, holding each other in the shadow of destruction, they both understood that this was truly the end of one story and the beginning of another. Whatever came next would have to be built from scratch, but they would build it together. 6 months later, the woman who had once been Rosalind Hart stood on the front porch of a half-built cabin, watching her husband guide their team of oxen through the furrows of their first wheat field. The Oregon Territory stretched around them in all directions, rolling hills covered in the green of early summer, a sky so vast and blue it took her breath away, even after all these weeks of waking up to it. She called herself Sarah Callahan now, and the name felt as natural as breathing. The refined Eastern lady who had fretted over social obligations and proper deportment seemed like someone from a story she'd once read, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the woman she'd become. "Sarah," Bo's voice carried across the field, and she waved back, noting the way he'd filled out in the months since they'd left Montana. Good food, honest work, and the absence of constant vigilance had softened some of the harder edges that 15 years of solitary mountain life had carved into him. He looked younger, happier, more at peace with himself than she'd ever seen him. The land they'd claimed was fertile and well-watered, with a view of snow-capped peaks in the distance that reminded them both of where they'd found each other. They'd built their cabin on a slight rise that caught the morning sun and overlooked the valley where they planned to graze cattle once they'd saved enough to buy stock. It wasn't large or elaborate, but every board and stone had been chosen and placed with love, with the sure knowledge that this was theirs, in a way the mountain cabin had never quite been. Their neighbors, the Andersons, lived about 2 miles east and had welcomed them with the practical kindness of frontier people who understood the value of community. Tom Anderson had helped Bo raise the cabin walls, while his wife Emma had taught Sarah the finer points of preserving food and managing a frontier household. They'd accepted the newcomer's carefully crafted story, without question a young couple from back east, seeking a fresh start in the territories like so many others. Nobody asked about the past, and Sarah and Bo offered no more information than necessary. They were simply the Callahans now, hard-working folks building a life from nothing, like countless others who'd made the same journey west in search of something better. The official documents they carried: marriage certificate, land claim papers, even a few letters of recommendation from fictitious business associates were works of art created by a man in San Francisco who specialized in helping people start over. Bo's old Marshall connections had proven useful in ways she'd never expected, leading them to resources and contacts that made new identities possible. But the most important change wasn't in their names or their papers. It was in the growing curve of Sarah's belly, the child that would be born as autumn turned to winter, carrying the future they were building together. "How are you feeling?" Bo asked as he came up the porch steps, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The afternoon heat was intense, and she could see the concern in his eyes as he noted how she was resting in the shade. Good, tired, but good. She stood and moved into his arms, inhaling the familiar scent of honest sweat and sunshine that clung to him. Emma says that's normal at this stage. His hand came up to rest on the swell of their child, and she felt the familiar flutter of movement that never failed to make them both smile. "Strong little one," he said softly, "just like his mother." "Or her mother." "Or her mother," he agreed, kissing the top of her head. "Have you been thinking about names?" They'd had this conversation before, but it had taken on new urgency as her time grew closer. Names were important. They were the first gift you gave a child, the foundation of identity that would last a lifetime. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Thomas, after your son." Bo went very still, and for a moment she worried she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. They'd talked about his first family, but carefully, respectfully, acknowledging the past without letting it overshadow their present. "You do that?" "I'd be honored to do that. He was part of you. Part of the man who saved me and loved me and gave me this life. I want our children to know about the people who came before them, the love that helped shape their father." When he looked at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And if it's a girl?" "I was thinking Catherine Sarah, after your wife and my new name, a bridge between who we were and who we've become." This time he did cry, just a few tears that he wiped away quickly, but his smile was radiant as he pulled her close as her expanding belly would allow. "I love you, Sarah Callahan." "I love you too, Bo Callahan." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the valley that would be their children's playground, Sarah found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought them here. The terror and pain of her old life seemed like something that had happened to someone else, faded to the distant significance of a cautionary tale. Even the violence that had ended it, Marcus Thornfield and his men buried under the Montana avalanche, felt like justice served by forces larger than human revenge. The newspapers they occasionally saw in town had carried the story, eventually. Eastern businessman and several associates lost in mountain accident while pursuing investment opportunities in mining. No mention of wanted fugitives or family disputes. Just another tragic reminder of the dangers faced by those who ventured into the unforgiving wilderness. She'd felt nothing when she read those accounts, no satisfaction, no guilt, no sense of closure. Marcus Thornfield belonged to her past, and she'd left her past buried under the snow, along with everything else that had tried to claim her. "No regrets?" Bo asked, as if he'd been following the same train of thought. "None," and she meant it completely. "You?" "Just one." She looked at him in surprise. "What?" "I wish I'd found you sooner. Wish we'd had more time. We have all the time in the world now." "We do, don't we?" He squeezed her hand, the wedding ring he'd placed there catching the last light of day. "Sometimes I wake up and can't quite believe it's real. That we made it, that we're here, that we get to build something lasting together. It's real." She brought his hand to her belly, where their child stirred restlessly in the warmth of the evening. "This is real. We're real." As full darkness settled over their valley, Sarah Callahan sat beside her husband and felt the deep satisfaction of a life chosen rather than assigned, built rather than inherited, defended rather than accepted. The woman who'd once fled into a blizzard to escape a gilded cage was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Someone who'd found her home, not in a place, but in the man beside her and the family they were creating together. Tomorrow would bring more work. There was always more work on a frontier homestead, but tonight there was only peace and love and the certain knowledge that they'd found what they'd been searching for all along. Not just safety or escape, but belonging. Not just survival, but a life worth living. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the darkening hills, wild and free and utterly alive. Sarah smiled and settled more comfortably against her husband's shoulder, one hand on her growing child, the other clasped firmly in his. They were exactly where they belonged.